Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The Badge and the Burden. Officer Mark Harrington sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel as he scanned the quiet streets of downtown. The city was settling into that golden hour between dusk and night, where the lights from street lamps began to flicker to life. The hum of his cruiser was a comforting sound, like a lullaby to his seasoned mind. The dashboard clock read 4:45 p.m., and the night shift loomed ahead. Mark had been on the force for over 15 years, his experience etched in the lines of his face and the sternness of his gaze. He'd built a reputation as a no-nonsense officer, someone who believed in the law's authority and the need for discipline in the world. He wasn't here to make friends, he was here to keep order. To him, rules were not mere suggestions, but mandates. The streets were filled with people who needed to understand that. It was his job to remind them of it. Earlier that afternoon, he'd issued citations to several young people, some for jaywalking, others for reckless driving, and even one for skateboarding on a sidewalk. To some, his approach was harsh, but to Mark, it was necessary. The law isn't soft, and neither should we be, he often told his fellow officers. Every ticket, every warning, was another brick in the wall of respect he believed he was building. Just a few hours earlier, he had pulled over a teenager for skateboarding on the sidewalk, weaving between pedestrians. The kid had begged for leniency, but Mark didn't have the patience for excuses. Rules are rules, he'd snapped, issuing a fine that left the boy in tears. To Mark, the kid was just trying to manipulate him with his emotions, something Mark had learned to ignore over the years. Life wasn't about feelings, it was about structure and authority. Anyone who thought otherwise was naive. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows on the pavement, Mark's thoughts shifted to his upcoming break. He was due for some downtime, a quick coffee before his patrol continued. He pulled into the station's parking lot, the sound of tires on gravel giving way to the hum of the city in the distance. The cruiser came to a stop, and Mark killed the engine, gathering his gear as he stepped out. His colleague, Officer Sarah Chen, was heading to her car, her uniform neat and professional as always. Sarah was an odd one in Mark's eyes, too empathetic, too in touch with people. She often talked about the importance of community relations, of building trust with the people they served. Mark, on the other hand, believed in the power of fear and authority. He didn't have time for what he saw as soft ideas. "Hey Mark," Sarah called, adjusting her bag over her shoulder. "Are you going to the new empathy training session tomorrow?" Mark snorted, dismissing the idea with a wave of his hand. "Waste of time," he muttered. "I've been doing this job just fine without it." Sarah gave him a look that was half sympathy, half disappointment. "The world's changing, Mark. Maybe we should too. We can't keep doing things the way we always have." "The world's getting soft," Mark shot back, his tone hard. "I'm not going to start coddling people, trying to understand them. We're not here to make friends, Sarah. We're here to enforce the law." Sarah shook her head slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "That's exactly why we need this training. Maybe we need to rethink how we approach people, how we build relationships." Mark rolled his eyes. He wasn't interested in hearing about relationships. He didn't need to be anyone's therapist, he needed to do his job, and that meant keeping people in line. The more Sarah spoke, the more irritated he became. The law was simple. You either followed it, or you faced the consequences. "Back in my day, when an officer gave an order, people listened," he grumbled, turning away from her. "No questions asked. None of this touchy-feely nonsense." Sarah paused, her expression softening as if she were about to say something more, but she seemed to think better of it. "Maybe that's part of the problem, Mark." Mark didn't respond. He simply walked toward the station, the sound of his boots echoing against the pavement, his mind already on the next shift, the next ticket, the next person he'd have to teach a lesson to. He didn't have time for doubts. He wasn't going to change. The world around him was changing, but Mark Harrington was going to stand firm in his beliefs, even if everyone else thought he was out of touch. The next morning was another typical day on the job. The sun rose, casting its warm light over the city, as Mark sat in his patrol car, staring out at the traffic on Cedar Avenue. This was one of the city's more upscale streets, lined with fancy boutiques, coffee shops, and restaurants. The type of neighborhood where people didn't expect to see much police activity. But Mark knew that wasn't the case. Crime didn't discriminate, it was everywhere, and it was his job to root it out. His radio crackled to life. Unit 247, we've got a report of a suspicious vehicle in your area. Black Mercedes sedan heading north on Cedar. Copy? Copy that, Mark replied, his attention shifting immediately. He straightened in his seat, focusing his eyes on the black Mercedes that had just entered his line of sight. It was pristine, almost gleaming in the sunlight. Too clean, too perfect, and that's what made Mark suspicious. He followed the car, observing its movement. It seemed fine, too fine, perhaps. Something about it struck him as off. As a seasoned officer, he trusted his instincts. He flipped on his lights and sirens, the unmistakable sound echoing down the street. The Mercedes smoothly pulled over into a nearby parking spot, and Mark approached the vehicle with caution. Inside, the driver was a woman, her skin dark, her posture composed as she sat behind the wheel, hands clearly visible on the steering wheel. Mark noted the absence of any immediate danger, but that didn't stop him from feeling a twinge of irritation. This wasn't a routine stop for him. This was the type of situation that could turn unpredictable, and he didn't like unpredictability. He approached the car with purpose, his hand hovering near his holster. The woman turned slightly to face him, her expression calm, though confusion flickered in her eyes. "Step out of the vehicle," Mark commanded, his voice sharp and commanding. The woman, Leslie, looked at him, her tone even as she replied, "Officer, may I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Mark's jaw tightened at the question. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not in such a calm manner. "I said step out of the vehicle," he repeated, more forcefully this time. Leslie's demeanor remained unchanged. "I understand, officer, but I have the right to know why I'm being stopped. I've been following all the traffic laws." Mark's patience began to fray. She wasn't angry, she wasn't defensive, she was simply challenging him, calmly, politely. And that, more than anything, made him angry. The audacity of someone questioning his authority, challenging his decisions, was too much to bear. His voice dropped lower, becoming more forceful, as he tried to assert control over the situation. "I won't ask again. Exit the vehicle now." Leslie, still calm, offered a quiet response. "My name is Leslie. I'm happy to comply, but I'd like to understand why I'm being stopped." Mark's irritation spiked. This woman was too composed, too steady for his liking. She wasn't intimidated by his uniform, by his badge, by his years of experience. She was standing her ground, and that, more than anything, was starting to get under his skin. Without another word, Mark yanked the door open and grabbed Leslie's arm, pulling her out of the car with force. He could feel the eyes of the people around him, the pedestrians, the drivers, beginning to focus on the situation. The judgment was palpable. He ignored it, his focus solely on maintaining control. "Listen, you're under arrest for failing to comply with an officer's orders," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. Leslie didn't resist as he spun her around and cuffed her. Instead, she stood still, her dignity intact despite the rough treatment. As he tightened the cuffs, Mark's senses heightened. He could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze on him, the disapproving whispers, the eyes that were now trained on him with judgment. But he didn't care. Not at first. The turning point. As Mark stood there, gripping Leslie's arm with cold precision, he could feel the tension building in the air around him. The soft murmurs of disapproval from the growing crowd were like a hum in the background, persistent and unyielding, but Mark was too focused on maintaining control to let it bother him. His entire career had been built on order, on command, on making sure people understood their place. His instincts told him that if he showed any weakness now, it would be the beginning of the end, his authority, his reputation, everything he'd worked for would crumble. Yet, despite his outward confidence, he felt the stirrings of unease inside him. It was a sensation that had been creeping up on him over the past year, a feeling that maybe things weren't as simple as they once seemed. But he pushed those thoughts away. This was no time for self-doubt. His eyes swept the crowd, scanning the faces of the bystanders. A few held up their phones, their cameras capturing every moment, every second of what was unfolding. Leslie didn't flinch as he roughly spun her around, handcuffing her with efficiency. She was calm, almost eerily composed. Mark had expected resistance, even anger, but there was none. Only a quiet, steady resolve. She was a woman who knew her rights, and more troubling to Mark, she wasn't afraid to stand up for them. The crowd's disapproving murmurs grew louder, but it didn't faze him. He had seen people stand around and watch before. They were just bystanders, people who never took action, who never understood the hard choices officers had to make. They didn't know the pressures Mark faced every day. They didn't see the threats, the danger lurking around every corner. He wasn't just an officer, he was a protector. That was his job. But then came the moment that shifted everything. "Everyone, stay back." Mark barked, his voice sharp and authoritative. His words were meant to assert control over the situation, to push back against the rising tide of discontent in the crowd. But instead of silencing them, his command only seemed to fuel the tension. He could hear the quiet gasps, the shocked whispers, the people shaking their heads in disbelief. Some even muttered words of encouragement to Leslie, as though they were rallying behind her. It was at that exact moment, when the crowd's judgment seemed unbearable, that Mark felt a new weight pressing down on him. He was used to being the one who imposed order, who took charge of any situation, but now, for the first time in years, he felt exposed. Vulnerable. His grip on Leslie's arm tightened involuntarily as his stomach churned. "Please, officer, can you just let me go?" Leslie's voice was soft, but there was a certain depth to it that made Mark pause. She wasn't pleading or begging for mercy, she was asking, calmly, as if she truly believed that her dignity could still be preserved. That her rights still mattered, even in the face of this situation. Before he could respond, the crackle of his radio shattered the silence. "Officer Harrington, this is Chief Ramirez. Release the woman immediately. I'm 2 blocks away." Over. The command hit Mark like a lightning strike. His heart skipped a beat as his stomach dropped. Chief Ramirez was coming. He had never heard his chief sound so cold, so firm, and it sent a wave of dread through his chest. He didn't have time to explain, to justify himself, to make it seem like this was all part of the plan. He was being called out, publicly, without warning. The cruiser pulled up to the curb, and Mark saw the figure of Chief Ramirez step out, his face grim. There was no sign of the usual camaraderie that Mark had come to expect from his superior. The chief was angry, and Mark knew it wasn't going to be good. "Release her." Now, Chief Ramirez commanded, his voice carrying a sharpness that Mark had never heard before. He was walking toward them, each step measured and deliberate, his gaze locked on Mark. Mark's heart raced. This was bad. Really bad. He fumbled for the handcuff key, his fingers suddenly unsure of their movements. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and the harsh light of the morning seemed to bear down on him. The cool, authoritative demeanor he had worked so hard to maintain began to slip, like sand through his fingers. His reputation, his career, everything seemed to be falling apart. When Mark finally managed to remove the cuffs, Leslie rubbed her wrists, looking at him without a word. She didn't thank him, didn't offer a smile or even a glare. She simply stood there, composed, as if this was just another moment in her life, a moment she would pass through with the same grace she had carried from the very beginning. The crowd, which had been eerily silent while Mark was fumbling, suddenly erupted. Applause filled the air, as if they had all been waiting for this moment, for Leslie to be freed, for Mark to be shown up in front of everyone. That sound, the clapping, the cheering, the collective display of support for Leslie, struck Mark harder than anything. He could feel the weight of it in his chest, like an anvil pressing down on him. He wanted to shrink into the ground, to disappear from the eyes of everyone. Leslie turned to walk away, her posture straight, her head high, despite the cuffs that had just been on her wrists. As she made her way back to her car, the crowd parted for her, almost reverential, as though she were a hero. A woman who had stood tall, who had faced injustice and come out on top. Mark's face flushed with humiliation. His once rigid, unwavering authority had been shattered in front of an entire city block. His eyes followed Leslie as she opened her car door and slid inside. As the crowd cheered her on, Mark could only stand there, his heart pounding in his chest. Chief Ramirez stood by, watching Leslie leave with the kind of respect Mark had never seen him give anyone. "I'm sorry, Leslie," the chief said, his voice softer now. "You're free to go." Leslie didn't look back, but she nodded slightly as if she acknowledged his apology. Then, as she drove away, her car disappearing around the corner, the applause gradually faded. Mark remained rooted to the spot, his body rigid, his hands trembling ever so slightly. The weight of the chief's disappointment was unbearable. He had been in situations before where things hadn't gone according to plan, but this was different. This was public. This was personal. The chief's voice broke through his thoughts. "Mark, come with me," Ramirez ordered, his tone stern but laced with an emotion Mark couldn't quite place, disappointment, anger, perhaps both. They walked back to the station in silence, the air between them heavy. Inside the precinct, the reality of what had just transpired began to set in. The incident was already spreading like wildfire on social media, the videos of Mark's actions shared and commented on by thousands. It wasn't just the crowd that had seen him fail, it was the whole world. Chief Ramirez didn't waste any time. "What happened today is not just about one bad traffic stop," he began as they entered the briefing room. "It's about a loss of trust, a loss of respect. What you did to Leslie Williams was not just unprofessional, it was dangerous. And it was discriminatory." Mark's jaw clenched. He wanted to speak, to justify himself, to explain that he had done what he thought was necessary. But the words wouldn't come. His colleagues, those he had worked beside for years, were watching him, their faces filled with a mix of shock and judgment. The chief continued, his voice growing louder. "This kind of behavior undermines everything this department stands for. We've worked too hard to build relationships with the community, to earn their trust. And you've undone all of that in a single moment." Mark could feel the weight of the chief's words in his gut, but he still couldn't find the courage to speak. His hands gripped the edges of his chair, and he knew that no matter what he said, nothing would change the fact that he had failed. The chief's next words were like a death sentence. "You're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation into your conduct. Hand me your badge and gun." The words felt like a physical blow. Mark stood frozen, unable to move, as the chief's gaze bore into him. The reality of his actions, the disgrace he had brought upon himself, his colleagues, his badge, began to settle in like a suffocating weight. It wasn't just his career on the line anymore, it was his entire identity. As he handed over his badge and gun, Mark realized that this was only the beginning. He would have to answer for his actions, and he wasn't sure if he could handle what came next. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, his world, his belief system, had just been shattered. And there was no going back. The path of reflection and redemption. The days following Mark's suspension felt like an eternity. The reality of his actions, and the consequences that followed, hung over him like a thick fog, clouding his every thought. No matter where he went, whether it was the empty streets of the city or the cold, sterile walls of the precinct, Mark couldn't escape the truth. He had made a mistake, a costly one, and now he was facing the fallout. It wasn't just about the suspension, the loss of his badge and gun, or the pending investigation into his conduct. It was about the way his entire world had crumbled in an instant, how everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, had been brought into question. The career he had dedicated his life to, the badge he had worn with such pride, had suddenly become a symbol of shame. For the first time in his life, Mark found himself questioning everything he had stood for. Was he really the man he thought he was? Was he really the upholder of justice, the protector of the innocent? Or had he become someone who had let his pride, his rigid sense of authority, cloud his judgment? The quiet days of suspension were the hardest. Mark found himself isolated, alone with his thoughts, with no uniform to hide behind. He spent most of his time at home, pacing the rooms of his apartment, staring out the window at the city he had once believed he understood. He tried to avoid the news and social media, knowing that the videos of his encounter with Leslie had already gone viral. He had seen the clips, his face, contorted in anger, the way he had grabbed Leslie's arm, the handcuffs clicking as he dragged her from her car. It was hard to watch, even harder to accept. One evening, after a particularly restless day, Mark found himself sitting at his kitchen table, staring at the folder that had been delivered to him earlier that week. Inside were the details of the department's mandatory empathy training program. He had tried to ignore it, to push it aside, but now, with everything that had happened, the words on the page seemed to taunt him. He ran his fingers over the folder, feeling the weight of the decision that lay ahead. The facilitator of the training program was none other than Leslie Williams, the woman he had wrongfully detained. It felt like an irony he couldn't escape. The woman he had humiliated, the woman whose life he had momentarily disrupted, was now in a position of power, tasked with teaching him something he had never wanted to learn, empathy. For the first time since the incident, Mark felt a flicker of humility. He knew he couldn't avoid the training. He didn't know what the future held, but he did know one thing: if he wanted to redeem himself, if he wanted to have any chance of salvaging his career, he had to start by understanding where he had gone wrong. The day of the training arrived, and Mark could feel the weight of it in his chest. He had never been one for introspection, never been one to look inward and question his actions. But today, he had no choice. The training center was small, tucked away in a quiet part of the city. As Mark entered the building, he noticed a few other officers milling about, their expressions tense, unsure of what to expect. There were no words exchanged as they filed into the classroom. The room was sparsely decorated, with a large whiteboard at the front and rows of chairs facing it. Mark found a seat in the back, hoping to go unnoticed, hoping to just get through the session without drawing attention to himself. The door to the room opened, and in walked Leslie. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he saw her for the first time since that fateful day. She was dressed in business attire, her posture still straight, her expression calm, composed, but there was a hardness in her eyes that Mark hadn't seen before. It was the kind of hardness that came from having been wronged, from having been pushed too far, but still maintaining the strength to rise above it all. She wasn't the same woman he had manhandled on the street. This Leslie was a woman who had been through something, and she was no longer afraid to stand up for herself. She stood at the front of the room, her eyes sweeping over the officers. Mark could feel her gaze land on him for a brief moment, and he couldn't look away. She was no longer a victim in his eyes. She was someone with power, with knowledge, and in that moment, Mark realized just how much he had underestimated her. "Good morning, officers," Leslie began, her voice clear and steady. "I know some of you might be wondering why I'm here, and I understand that. But I'm here because I believe that real change starts with understanding, with empathy, and with acknowledging the harm that's been done. And the first step in understanding is listening." Mark sat in silence as Leslie spoke, each word seeming to cut through the thick tension in the room. Her words weren't accusatory, but they were firm, grounded in a truth that Mark could no longer deny. He had failed to listen that day. He had failed to see Leslie as a person, as someone with her own dignity, her own rights. He had seen her only as a subject to control, as someone who had crossed a line. But in doing so, he had crossed a much greater line, the line that separated authority from oppression, fairness from injustice. Leslie continued, outlining the importance of listening, of understanding the people you were meant to serve. She talked about how easy it was for people in positions of power to overlook the humanity of others, especially when they were perceived as different. She spoke of the small moments of bias, the microaggressions that often went unnoticed, but that could have devastating consequences. Mark listened, his mind racing. He hadn't realized how deep the roots of his own biases went until Leslie pointed them out. He hadn't understood how the rules he had enforced so rigidly had been a shield for his own prejudices. As the training progressed, Mark found himself reflecting more and more on his actions. The exercise wasn't just about apologizing or feeling guilty, it was about changing the way he thought, the way he saw the world. It was about challenging his assumptions, confronting his past mistakes, and recognizing the harm he had caused. Leslie didn't make him apologize. She didn't ask him to grovel or admit his guilt in front of everyone. Instead, she simply asked him to acknowledge what had happened, to see the pain he had caused, and to commit to doing better. And in that moment, Mark felt something shift inside him. It wasn't a magic moment of instant clarity, but it was a step forward. For the first time, he realized that being an officer wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about serving the community, understanding the people you protected, and realizing that the laws were meant to protect people, not just enforce rules. At the end of the session, as Mark stood to leave, Leslie approached him. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, her presence still commanding but not aggressive. She was giving him space, letting him take in everything she had taught. And for a moment, Mark simply stood there, unsure of what to say. "Thank you," he finally said, his voice quiet but genuine. Leslie nodded, her expression unreadable. "I hope you remember what you've learned here today," she replied, her words calm but carrying a weight that Mark could feel in his chest. As he left the training center, Mark didn't feel like a man who had been redeemed. But he did feel like someone who had started the process of change. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But it was a beginning, a moment where he had recognized his failings and taken the first step toward understanding the world through a different lens. Mark knew the road ahead would be difficult. There would be more training, more self-reflection, and more hard conversations. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was a way back for him. Maybe he could rebuild the trust he had lost. Maybe, just maybe, he could become the officer he had always wanted to be, the kind of officer who protected and served, not just with authority, but with understanding. Redemption, realization, and the cost of change. The weeks following the empathy training passed in a blur. Mark's suspension had been lifted, but the shadow of his past actions still loomed over him like a dark cloud. He returned to active duty with the weight of everything he had learned, and everything he had yet to understand, bearing down on him. It was clear that the journey to redemption wasn't something that could be achieved in a few weeks or months. It was a long and painful process that required more than just completing mandatory programs. It required Mark to confront the very foundation of who he was and how he had viewed the world. He went back to patrolling, but it was different now. There was a constant reminder in the back of his mind that he had to be vigilant, not just about the people he was supposed to protect, but about his own actions, his own biases. Every traffic stop, every interaction with the public, felt more fraught. Where he had once acted with the unshakable confidence of a man in control, now he found himself second-guessing, pausing to take a breath, and reminding himself to approach every situation with patience and empathy. But the true test of his growth would come in the most unexpected way. It wasn't going to come from some official test or from a reassessment of his behavior by his superiors. No, the real test would come from the people he least expected. It started with a routine traffic stop on a quiet afternoon, one of those uneventful moments that often passed without much thought. Mark was stationed near the entrance of a popular park on the outskirts of town, scanning for speeders or drivers breaking traffic laws. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows on the asphalt, when a car swerved slightly as it passed him. It wasn't dangerous, but it was enough to catch his attention. Mark flicked on his lights and pulled the car over. As he approached the vehicle, his first instinct was to size up the driver, to make a quick judgment based on the car and the driver's demeanor. But then, he stopped himself. It was a reflex he had learned to check, and he was proud of the progress he had made. His hand rested lightly on the car door handle, but his mind was focused on the driver, not his own assumptions. The window rolled down, and Mark was met with the tired eyes of a middle-aged man. His clothes were worn, his hands rough with years of labor. The man's face was weathered, and his posture suggested a life of struggle. It was the kind of person Mark had often dismissed before, labeling them as irresponsible or careless. But today, he didn't let those thoughts invade his mind. "Good afternoon, sir," Mark began, his voice calm and neutral. "I pulled you over because you drifted a little out of your lane there. Is everything all right?" The man looked at him, slightly startled but not defensive. "Yeah, sorry, officer. Just been a long day. I'm just trying to get home." Mark nodded. There was something in the man's voice that struck him, a quiet exhaustion that was all too familiar. "Where are you headed?" The man pointed toward the nearby neighborhood, a place Mark knew to be under-resourced and often associated with crime. The man seemed to sense Mark's unease as he looked down at the address, and he added, "I know it's not the best neighborhood, but I'm just trying to get to my place. I don't mean no harm." Mark, still holding on to his commitment to listen, paused. He could have easily given the man a ticket, reprimanded him for the slight traffic infraction, and sent him on his way. It would have been the easier thing to do, the path that required no extra effort or introspection. But Mark could feel the weight of everything he had learned in that empathy training, the need to go beyond the surface, to see beyond the uniform and the badge, to see the human being in front of him. "All right," Mark said after a moment, his voice softer than usual. "I'm going to let you off with a warning this time, but I want you to stay safe out there. Take care of yourself." The man blinked in surprise, as if he had expected the opposite. You're not giving me a ticket?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Mark shook his head. "Not today. Just drive safely, all right?" The man's expression softened. "Thank you, officer. I really appreciate it." As the man drove away, Mark stood there for a moment, watching the car disappear down the road. It wasn't just the fact that he had let someone go, it was the realization that he had done it without any pride, without any need to prove himself or his authority. He had simply acted as a human being, as someone who understood that sometimes people just needed a break. It was a small moment, but it felt like a breakthrough. For the first time in a long while, Mark didn't feel the need to assert control, to be the one who was always right. In that brief exchange, he had done what Leslie had taught him, he had listened, he had seen the man for who he was, not for what he appeared to be. And in doing so, he had taken a step closer to becoming the officer he truly wanted to be. The real challenge, however, was still to come. Mark knew that his journey toward redemption wasn't over yet, and there were more lessons ahead. It wasn't just about how he interacted with people on the street, but about how he reconciled the man he had been with the man he wanted to become. The road to change was never straightforward. There would be times when his old ways of thinking would resurface, when his biases would try to take control. And when those moments came, Mark would have to be ready. It was about making the choice every day to be better, to be kinder, to be more aware of the impact he had on others. It wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. As Mark sat in his patrol car that evening, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about Leslie, about how she had stood in front of him in that training session, calm and composed, teaching him lessons he hadn't wanted to learn. He thought about how she had shown him that real strength wasn't about asserting power over others, it was about lifting them up, about showing them respect, even when they didn't deserve it. He remembered the words she had said to him when she was arrested, "I hope you see what you're doing someday." Those words had stuck with him, echoed in his mind, and now he was beginning to understand their full meaning. It wasn't about vengeance or anger. It was about awakening to the truth, about recognizing the humanity in every person, no matter their background or circumstance. Mark wasn't perfect, and he knew he would never be. But he was trying. He was trying to be a better man, a better officer, and that effort was what mattered. He would never forget what he had learned, nor would he ever forget the faces of the people he had wronged. Every step he took from here on out would be guided by the lessons of his past, as painful as they were, and the desire to make amends for the damage he had caused. And as he drove through the streets of the city that night, Mark felt a sense of peace, a feeling he hadn't known in a long time. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a while, he felt like he was on the right path. Mark had been given a second chance, and he was determined to make it count.